Well, we are fortunate tonight to be the recipients of a presentation. I say presentation because historically I have done the interviewing of longtime Potrero Hill residents. This resident, however, the cleverest of them all, did not want to be interviewed. She wanted to make her own presentation. And she will make the fine presentation of the life of Marie Ostler on Potrero Hill. And please come on. Here. And Marie, somewhere in your presentation, I have been asked that you answer the question of, when did you get that car?
1963.
Well, there's the answer. All right.
And I paid $3,200 for it. How much is it worth now? About $30,000. But I'm going to be buried in it, so it doesn't. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. The question is, can a little girl coming from a small mining town, Bingham Canyon, Utah, make it in the big city, like you see in this old Western where I was born and lived there until I was age 7? Yes, she can make it, because in April of 1946, she came to Potrero Hill when her father was able to find a little cottage at 508A Connecticut Street, and she has been here ever since. Little did she and her family know that they would live on a block with many other Italians. These were the people they were soon to know: Diascenti, Aliotto, and many others. Next door at 510 were the Diascentis, where I met my first girlfriend, Mary Ann. Years later, I became the godmother to her third son, and her oldest son, Bill, is working the projector for me tonight. Across the street were Mary Ann's grandparents, the Jamaris. Later, Rosemary would find another friend, Anna Aliotto. She lived directly across the street at 531, and we have spent many hours together, and I still am in contact with her. My brother Joe would become friends with Anna's brother Angelo. From 20th Street up to the dead end was a totally ethnically mixed street. The Italians and the Greek families, Gigatagas and Chrysanthus. Latins like Rodriguez, Garcia, Ramirez, Gonzalez. There were also Slovenians, Jaklovich, Laskatov, and many, many others. This one block was a melting pot of immigrants. In 1906, after the earthquake and fire, a large settlement of Slovenian people came to Potrero Hill. They mainly lived on Vermont and Kansas Street, and in 1927 bought the building at Vermont and Mariposa, which is the Slovenian Hall, and which I manage today. The names became familiar with are, to just name a few, Sesterich, Jednik, Radovich, and Stark. Many of the Russian immigrants who settled in San Francisco found employment in the Union Iron Works in Dogpatch, which later became Bethlehem Steel. They were eager to settle in the new land where they could have freedom of religion. The Russians built their homes on the top of Potrero Hill, around the streets of Carolina, Rhode Island, Haro, and Southern Heights. At 841 Carolina Street, the Molokon, or First Russian Christian Molokon Church, built about 1930, can still be seen. Many of my classmates at Daniel Webster were Russians. Some were named Sasoyev, Loskotov, Kanahan, Zaryakov. This was taken in 1950. Potrero Hill was a well-kept secret in the 40s and 50s. One reason being we were surrounded by industry, and there were many sights with sounds and smells. Mission Bay was the Southern Pacific rail yards. At night, one could hear the banging of the cars being coupled and moved around, and there are still many railroad tracks around the hill. This also shows the Baker Hamilton building, which has been declared historical. Another sound was from the can company and the clacking of the cans on the conveyor belts at 17th and Haro. Of course, there was also American Can on 3rd Street. There was the smell of coffee roasting, which came from a building by Jackson Park. It wasn't Hills Brothers at that time, but my father worked at Hills Brothers on Harrison Street for 25 years until his retirement. He loaded boxcars most of those years and was very proud of the fact that he could beat all the young men they partnered him with. One could smell soap from the Pioneer Soap Company on DeHaro, where my dad had worked for a few days. He would bring home big bars of soap, and my mom would shave the pieces into the washing machine. I loved putting the clothes through the wringer, but I had to be careful not to get my hands caught in there. Another great smell came from the bread factory, which was located at this building at Potrero and 15th. The spice factory, which still operates today, is at 195 Arkansas. And of course, the worst smell came from Butchertown, which was in the Bayview district. It was south of Islas Creek, where Bayview Plaza is today. Believe it or not, in Outer 3rd Street was a slaughterhouse and a tallow factory. And cowboys actually drove cows down 3rd Street to the slaughterhouse there. The awful smell would waft up to Potrero Hill, but we just got used to it. When someone asked where you lived and you said Potrero Hill, they would turn up their nose and say, "Oh, over there?" I never told them what a wonderful place it really was. Of course, now the response is different. The response is, "Oh, you live there, wow." Let me tell you what it was like growing up on Potrero Hill and what Potrero Hill was like in the 40s and 50s. Very soon after our arrival, my mother told me to go to the corner and learn how to spell Connecticut, as she wanted to tell her family in Utah her address. I did just that and stood outside the grocery store at the corner of Connecticut and 20th. Joe Dunnigan was the owner, and it still is and has been a grocery store for these 73 years. And supposedly the practice of putting street names in the sidewalk came after the 1906 earthquake, when devastation was so bad, people did not know where they were standing. My mother took me to Daniel Webster to enroll me. We went in the office, and there was Miss Tripp, the secretary. She looked at my 2nd grade report card from Bingham and determined I should go to High 2nd. In those days, the semester year was divided in two: fall, September to January, and spring, February to June. In today's world, I don't think the secretary would determine where a student be placed. Because of Ms. Tripp's decision, I graduated high school at age 17. Daniel Webster was a wonderful grammar school. It went from kindergarten through 8th grade. I still remember the names of all my teachers, as they had a lasting effect on my life. Miss Caston, my first at Daniel Webster. Mrs. Harmuth, then Miss Kavanaugh, and two male teachers whose names I'm not using, as you will understand why. Mr. L., who had served in World War I and had a plate in his head. He would get very angry and often turn and throw a piece of chalk at the bad boys. Mr. S., who also got angry, one day flipped Jimmy's desk over with Jimmy in it. Wow, can you imagine what would happen today? Then there was Mr. Shembri, who let us listen to the World Series, but we had to figure out batting averages. The love of my life was Miss Moresco, who was in little theater, so we put on many plays. I was Alice of Alice in Wonderland, and had a blue dress similar to the picture, which I wore in the play. My girlfriend Dina was the rabbit in a costume her aunt made. Then I had the lead as Prudence, the heroine in our old-fashioned melodrama. It was called Egbert to the Rescue. Egbert saved our home from the mean villain by somehow getting the rent money for my father and I. So, of course, the last line of the play was mine when I said, "Oh, Egbert, my big, handsome hero." A few years ago, I saw Bob Canahan, who played the hero, and I said those lines to him. He looked at me as if I was crazy. He didn't remember being in the play. This went on every time I saw him, and we had a good laugh. Unfortunately, Bob passed away a few years ago. My 8th grade teacher was Mrs. Small, and this was graduation day. We walked to school as we lived in the neighborhood, and we arrived before 8:10, before school started. We lined up by class in the big yard, said the Pledge of Allegiance, and often heard a message from the balcony by our principal, Miss Brimskill. You can imagine what she looked like from her name. She was a large, overpowering woman, and of whom we were all afraid. I found out years later from Mr. Pivnik, the vice principal, she was a lovely woman who liked to party. Our teachers would then lead us into our classrooms, always going up the hallways and the stairs on the right-hand side. Everyone always walked on the right-hand side of everything, including sidewalks. It was very civilized. We received an incredibly well-rounded education, from reading, writing, and arithmetic to social studies, art, music, drama. There was a band for those learning a musical instrument. I particularly remember doing art with colored chalk and finger painting. I loved using my hands to finger paint, and I did underwater scenes with seaweed and fish. I remember studying Holland and windmills, and I tried to draw a windmill with the chalk, but I could never get those windmills' arms going in the right direction. We learned folk dancing, often on rainy days and after school, which was taught by Mr. Pivnick. The Virginia reel was his specialty. We were taught all Christmas carols, both secular and religious. In 7th and 8th grade, girls had sewing and cooking. We started out sewing by hemming dish towels, which taught us everything about the machines. In 8th grade, my girlfriend Dina and I made matching sundresses using a simplicity pattern. And the boys had shop. There was student council with a representative from each class. At Mr. Pivnick's urging, I was the first female to run for student body president. My girlfriend Dina was my campaign manager. And we made many posters to put up around the school. My opponent was Mike Sintai. And we had to make a campaign speech from the balcony to the entire student body. I don't remember my speech, but Mike promised ping pong at lunchtime. He won, and we never got ping pong at lunchtime. It was my first introduction to campaign promises that never get realized. The other neighborhood schools were Patrick Henry on Vermont, where most of the Slovenian kids attended. It is now downtown school. St. Teresa's was on Pennsylvania for the Catholic kids. They had no playground, so the street in front was blocked off during recess and lunchtime. It worked as there was very little automobile traffic in those days. This was also the convent for the Presentation nuns. There was a gentleman, Mr. Dan Perea, who worked on the railroad and lived in a boxcar with his wife Eloisa and son Epic. Mr. Perea loved taking care of the nuns. Whenever they needed a ride or some type of help, they would raise a flag up a pole that was on the roof, which was his signal to come and get them. This beautiful building got torn down when the 280 freeway was built because it was damaged. The oldest school on Potrero Hill is Irving M. Scott, originally built in 1865 and was on 20th and 3rd, but is now at 1060 Tennessee Street. The original students were children of the workers in Dogpatch, and it was named a historical landmark in 1985. Just being in the neighborhood, we got to know kids from all the schools. We had a reunion in the 80s, and it was entitled, "We Went to Different Schools Together." Oftentimes, we walked home for lunch as our mothers were home. My mother would get together with Josephine Alioto, who lived across the street, and we four, my brother Joe and I, and Angelo and Anna Alioto, would have lunch and then walk back to school together. My brother, who is 5 years younger, got to be a crossing guard. Boys were corner guards for Daniel Webster. They stood on the corners and made sure students crossed safely in the morning, lunchtime, and after school. There was an annual get-together every year at Kezar Stadium, where all school crossing students met and marched in formation. The winning schools got an award. I wanted to be a crossing guard, and I couldn't understand why girls weren't allowed. We've come a long way, baby, but we're still not equal. Evie and Tony's establishment was across the street from Daniel Webster at the southeast corner. They sold hot dog sandwiches and ice creams. On rainy days, students could order lunch from there, mainly hot dogs. Joe, my brother, worked at Evie's restaurant to prepare the rainy day lunches and sell sodas from the coolers so the kids wouldn't take them. He got a free lunch for his efforts. When he married Pat in 1969, their first residence was in Evie's and Tony's apartment behind the store, and Tony would continue to make him his best root beer floats. Right before lunchtime, lunches would be delivered to each room in the large round cartons that ice cream came in. We would stay in the classroom and eat, which meant the teacher had to stay with us. The auditorium, which remains today, was not used as a multi-purpose room then. My girlfriend Dina and I loved helping the school secretary, the principal, the vice principal, and our teachers. We took care of the library every day. We made and put up decorations for every holiday, and were given bookends by Mr. Pivnik when we graduated. I still have them. And he was a lifelong friend, and many of you may remember my interviewing him 2 years ago at History Night. When I was in 7th grade, we had a fire at Daniel Webster. It was set by a troubled 12-year-old boy. Dina came early to meet me and told me the school had a fire during the night. I finished my breakfast and we went to see the damage. Most students were thrilled. They had a day off. But Dina and I hung out and were soon put to work. In today's world, it would be unheard of to have school children go into a fire-damaged school. Dina and I actually went into the damaged rooms and helped carry out the books and equipment that were salvageable. It amazes me today to think of the danger and the liability. I can remember it being very creepy, and I did not like being in the charred room and standing on the charred floors. The smell was terrible. We worked until they sent us home. I don't recall our parents being concerned that we worked in a fire-damaged school. Mr. Pivnik had tried to help this troubled kid. When Mr. Pivnik arrived, he spoke to someone from the fire department who didn't know Mr. Pivnik's name. He told Mr. Pivnik, "We think we know who did it," because on one of the boards was written, "F.U. Pivnik." The fireman thought the culprit had signed the board. Mr. Pivnik said, "I'm Pivnik." Because it was the 7th and 8th grade rooms that were damaged, we went to Everett Junior High until the rooms were repaired. We kids had great fun playing outside all the time, after school, after dinner, and all day during the summer. Connecticut Street from 20th on up was a great place for kids to play, as it dead ends, and there were very few cars coming and going. We kids had great freedom in the 40s and 50s. We rode bikes up and down the streets and hills without helmets. I skated until my ball-bearing wheels had holes in them. Again, no helmets, no knee pads, no elbow pads. I always had scraped knees, and I still have a scar to prove it. The key was always around my neck, so I could tighten the clamps or adjust the length of the skate if necessary. Somehow we survived. We drew a hopscotch pattern on the sidewalk with chalk, and played for hours. We used any object we could find, a rock, a chain, as a tor. How many of you know that word, tor? That was the thing you threw on the sidewalk. Someone always had a rope for jumping, usually from an old clothesline. And if it was only two of us playing, we would tie one end to a fence or a railing. One would turn and the other would jump. We sat down on the sidewalk and played jacks, onesies, twosies, eggs in the basket, where you had to throw the ball up, grab the number of jacks, put them in the other hand, and catch the ball before it hit the ground. We played so much, I always wore down the fingernail on my little finger, scraping it on the cement to pick up the jacks. The playground up at the top of Arkansas was dirt, sand, and concrete. Maybe we got a scrape here and there, but I don't remember anyone getting seriously hurt. Note the large tank in the background. There were many of these on the hill. During the summer, we spent hours swinging and sliding. We were never bothered by the hot metal slide. We just had enough sense not to go down on rare hot days. I can remember touching it to see how hot it was. I loved the rings, and we were up there playing with our friends, and most of the times no parents were there watching us. During the summer, our mothers would pack us a lunch, and we would play up in the trees at the end of Connecticut. All day, pretending to be cowboys and cowgirls, like Roy Rogers and Dale Evans from a movie we had seen. There was no fear of kidnapping, or worse, no play dates were arranged by parents, as we found our own friends. We got dirty, and we didn't have any antiseptic anything. And quite frankly, we very rarely got sick. The boys had much more freedom than we girls. They wandered all over the neighborhood. My brother Joe and his friends made coasters by looking in the neighborhood for wood and parts. They would find old wheels, sometimes from skates. They would ride them down from the top of 20th, hopefully Connecticut and not Wisconsin Street. In later years, they would ride their bikes from the top. Again, it was easier than today because there were fewer cars coming and going. He said we would play sports in the streets, baseball, football, until it got dark. He stated when we broke a window, I would not run and hide. I would buy the glass from the hardware on Connecticut, which was Ferraris, and replace the windows myself. We would spend time at the neighborhood house and the Arkansas playground. He recalled they got pollywogs from standing pools at the bottom of Arkansas and 17th. I don't think those pollywogs ever made it to a frog. He said Angelo, Jimmy Condon, and I would go fishing on the piers with worms we would buy from the corner store. One late afternoon, the police called our house and said Joe and Angelo were in the 3rd Street police station for throwing rocks at the train as it came out of the tunnel. My father had to go down and pick them up. Here's my brother's story about the event. We got arrested for spitting on the commuter trains on the way home. They thought we were throwing rocks. We had to go to juvenile hall to tell our story. We all got together to make sure our stories matched. So we would not go to jail for the rest of our lives. Such freedom we had. The neighborhood house was a great place. Many activities were available to kids, and I took tap dance lessons from June Patrick. We also did tumbling. My mother made this dress for me, and we wore our dresses when we performed. It had June Patrick Studios embroidered on it. As I recall, each lesson cost 50 cents. I did a solo tap number at a Daniel Webster assembly. When I was 48 years old, I began taking tap again and was involved in a 6.5-mile, nonstop, long-distance tap from Girardelli Square to Macy's in Union Square. And I wound up in the Guinness Book of World Records. But that's a whole nother story for next time. 20th Street, 18th Street, and Connecticut Street all had businesses as they do today. The 22 was a streetcar in those days and made the same turn at 18th and Connecticut. And that was a grocery store there on the corner. At the corner of 20th and Connecticut on the east side, you had M&M Meat Market, where everything was fresh cut and nothing was packaged in plastic. Directly across the street was Lucas Superette, a grocery store, just as it is today, but it was run by Joe Dunnigan. My brother and I would get 10 cents after dinner and go down to the store and buy a Chocho ice cream. Anyone remember Chochos? You had to roll them back and forth between the palm of your hands to be able to pull it out of the cup, and they were so yummy. At 1607 20th was Atchison's Pharmacy and Drugstore. It not only had the regular drugstore items, but the pharmacy, as you can see from the sign. I don't remember the liquor, but they must have had some. Believe it or not, it had a post office in the back right corner. Irma Mashaga was the postmistress for many years. This is the pharmacist, Dave Bonelli, who was married to the owner's daughter, and Alma, the woman who became the postmistress after Irma. One could not only buy stamps and mail packages, but they could pay their PG&E, water bill, and telephone bill. Most people did not have checking accounts, and they used cash, so this was a great convenience. Best of all, there was a regular soda fountain with red cushioned stools, cherry cokes, and chocolate sodas. Yummy. Mr. Galley was the owner, and he lost his 20-year-old son in World War II. This plaque is still on the building. Robert Galley, born November 23rd, 1924, died July 22nd, 1944. This is what the library looked like when I arrived in 1946. It was at the location of the current Chinese School of Medicine. I read many books from that old library on Connecticut, which was the original Daniel Webster School. It was all wooden with many shelves. One day I checked out a book, went home, read it, and then tried to return it. The librarian said I couldn't return it the same day. She said I couldn't possibly have read it. I assured her I had read it because I am a fast reader, as I am today. I just couldn't understand why I couldn't get another book. The new library was built in 1951 when it was dedicated by State Senator Tom Maloney. Mr. Pivnick led some of us girls, as children, from Daniel Webster in a folk dance. Little did I know that years later, in 1969, I would meet my future husband, Mickey, at a Potrero Boosters meeting in the room upstairs. Now I would like to tell you about some of the businesses on 20th and Connecticut Streets. This is an idea of what a fun, funky store at 1619 looked like. It was called Hilltop Variety. It was run by a short, unique man named Nick Frigo. We called the store Frigo's, and you could get everything there from bobby pins to hairnets to needles and thread and nylon stockings. Who needed Target when we had Frigo's? Koch, or Cocciolato, had his barbershop at 1627. He would later move down to 18th and Connecticut, where Papito's is today. After Koch moved again, that became a shoemaker's shop. Flo would come later at 1532 20th. He cut hair there until his recent death. Now his son Sal is standing in the same spot. A few doors down from Flo's at 1512, which is still vacant, was a beauty shop. One of my favorite memories is for Strand Service at the corner of 20th and Connecticut, where Zephyr Realty is today. It was Strand Appliance Store, and when TVs first came out, he had one in the window. And on Tuesday nights, the station would broadcast wrestling. And I mean wrestling, not the fake ones like today. My dad and I would go down to the corner, stand in front of the TV, freezing, and watch guys like 49er Leo Nomalini and the tag team Sharp Brothers. There were a few other men there watching. I loved it, and later I got the autographs somewhere from the Sharp Brothers. At 1524 20th, where the Good Life is today, in 1947, there was a photographer there for a short time, and I had my first communion picture taken there. Many of Daniel Webster Catholic students took catechism classes at St. Teresa's School and became friendly with the students there. At 1700 20th, you had Mary Wall's Cleaners, called L&H, and of course, directly across the street, De Rosa Brothers Grocery, which had been there since 1930 and was run by the sons of the original proprietor, Joe and Marty. They were great guys. There were no Safeways then. Everything was mom and pop. Marty's son, Philip, said there was a Merchants semi-pro baseball team. Marty is on the left. The DeRosas gave out a calendar every year, and this one was from 1934. I often was sent to the store with a list and would shop for my mom. Along with the groceries, I would sometimes carry a gallon bottle of Pellegrini wine for my dad. Can you imagine selling a gallon of wine to a 10-year-old today? Marty and Joe DeRosa always had a teenager working in the store helping out. When my brother Joe turned 16 and had a driver's license, he worked at DeRosa's Grocery. He stocked shelves, waited on customers, and delivered groceries in Marty's old truck. This is DeRosa's then and now a beauty shop. Speaking of wine, in the 50s, many of the Italian men on the Hill, Flo, Frank DeAngelis, Mr. Cardani, and my dad, Agostino, made their own Zinfandel wine in their basements. They would get together and order the grapes from Napa, and the delivery men would go from house to house, crush the grapes in a crusher on the truck. It would be pumped into a large barrel in the garage, and then they dumped the grapes in the juice. It would ferment for several days, and after checking the sugar content, the owner would put the juice and crushed grapes in the press. It would squeeze out all the juice, which would then be put in 50-gallon barrels, where it would sit for at least a year before use. The smell of fermenting grapes would permeate the entire house, and the smell was delicious. At that point, the juice would taste just like very sweet grape juice. I have fond memories of my dad making wine. Once a week, on Fridays, the fish man would come up Connecticut Street. Those were the days the Catholics did not eat meat on Friday. He had an open bed truck where boxes were stacked with ice, and all kinds of fish were available. He would honk the horn, and housewives would come out and buy fresh fish for dinner. And there was a scale hanging above where he would weigh the fish. At 344 Connecticut Street was Ferraris Hardware, where Mr. and Mrs. Ferrari are in this picture. As you can see from the picture, if you needed it, they had it. If they didn't have it, you didn't need it. Notice the light bulbs on the right and all the baking equipment on the lower left shelf. Wouldn't you love to go back in time and rummage around this store? Movies were pretty much our main entertainment. Almost every Sunday, my mom, brother, and I would go to the matinee at the new Potrero Theater at 18th and Connecticut Streets. We would have our usual lunch of pasta, quickly do the dishes, and be at the movie house before the 1 p.m. start. The theater was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Holmes. She was short and pudgy, he tall and thin. She wore a white uniform with great yellow epaulets on the shoulders, with big gold buttons and a white captain's hat, and under the hat, a big black wig. He had a black suit with a white shirt and a bow tie. She would patrol the aisles during the movie with her flashlight, waiting to catch naughty kids. And he always hovered in the background. Everyone in the neighborhood called this theater the Flea Hole, because you always went home with a couple of bites. When we arrived, we would pay our 50 cents and enter through the side door. We would head for the old-fashioned popcorn machine, put out a little brown bag, and insert our 5 cents. Out would come stale and salty popcorn, but we loved it. Sometimes we would buy candy, maybe Necco wafers and jujubes. We saw wonderful movies, mostly musicals, such as Singing in the Rain with Gene Kelly, my favorite. Meet Me in St. Louis with Judy Garland and Margaret O'Brien. Yankee Doodle with Jimmy Cagney. This is where I began my love of tap dancing. Of course, there were Walt Disney movies, Snow White, Cinderella, Pinocchio. It was a wonderful way to spend an afternoon. We always came out happy. There were no downers. We would then go home and Mom would make pizza on English muffins. Sorry, no, goat tail. And we would get our weekly bottle of Coke. Those two were wonderful memories. 2 doors down at 300 Connecticut Street, which is now Goat Hill Pizza, was the Corner Creamery. It was the happy days hangout of the day. You couldn't get a sandwich, ice cream soda, and listen to music on the jukebox by putting your coin in the tabletop record choice machine. Guys like Flo and Phil DeRosa, Epic and their buddies would hang out at the creamery. When we graduated from Daniel, many of us went to Polytechnic High School, which was across the street from Kezar Stadium. The boys were off to Everett Junior High as Daniel had changed to a K-6. We took the bus starting with the 53 at 20th and Connecticut, which ran all around the hill, and then transferred to the 33 or the N. Judah streetcar. Please note, no backpacks and brown paper bag lunches, and no parents driving kids to school. In this picture, we were waiting for the 53, and a wonderful bus driver, Neil, who was always on time and friendly. We had the Clipper card of the day called car tickets. It had 10 punches, which we bought at school for 50 cents a week. It was good for the 2 rides each day. Neil would often take the car ticket and punch over an already punched hole. He winked at us, and we just said thank you. It was a very personal world. I call this the chorus line. It's somewhat amazing. We all grew up on the same block, were the same age by a few months, and continued to be friends for many years. Left to right, Jeanette Motini, Antoinette Jakovich, me, Marianne Diascenti, and Anna Alioto. In 1957, my mother and her friend Josephine got a part-time job at See's Candy, which was located, I think, on Alabama Street. We always had See's Candy chocolates in our house, as they sold a bag of rejects to employees for 50 cents. It's now about $20 a pound box. We were very lucky. Her working at See's and my dad at Hills Brothers Coffee allowed my parents to finally buy a home at 1707 20th Street, next door to DeRosa's Grocery. They paid $11,750. They paid it off in 6 years. Fortunately, my brother and I still own it. Can you imagine what my mom and dad would think about its current value? Of course, cell phones were unheard of in the 40s and early 50s, and it was a while before we had a telephone in the house. When we got one, it hung on the wall in the hall with a long cord. The only problem was it was a party line. So oftentimes, when you picked up the receiver, you would hear someone talking. Of course, being the good person you were, you did not listen in. If this went on for a long time, you would put the receiver back in place a little loudly so that the other party would know you were trying to use the phone. It usually worked. Our phone number was Mission 77619. I thought it would be fun for you to see the telephone numbers. This was taken from a city directory. MI was Mission, or 64. VA was Valencia, or 82. And AT was Atwater, or 28. There was a man on Market Street who would take photos of people walking down the street. He caught my brother and I in about 1956. I was working at S.H. Kress at the time. You can see the sign, and the store on the corner was J.C. Penney. That's 5th and Market Streets. Their restaurant on the mezzanine made the best shrimp Louis salads. My girlfriend Dina and I couldn't wait to get a job. You could get a permit at 15 and a half and start working at 16. We interviewed at Kress, and she was put to work downstairs in the lampshades, and I was given the notions counter on the first floor. Coincidentally, the notions were the same type of items that I mentioned you could buy at Frigo's. We worked on Saturdays, and it was not long after that the stores downtown began staying open on Monday nights till 9 o'clock. That worked so well, they started staying open on Thursday nights too. So we got to work after school from 4 to 9 and loved it. I worked there until I graduated with an AA from City College. You could count on the buses then with regular hours. We got off at 9, went upstairs, picked up our $2 dinner money, walked quickly to the Old Mint on 5th, got the 25 bus, and got off at 16th and Bryant. The 53 Southern Heights was waiting for us. We jumped on and were home by 9:30 or 9:45. There was absolutely never any problem. There is so much more to tell you, but if you haven't already bought a copy of Peter Linenthal and Abigail Johnson's books, San Francisco Potrero Hill and Potrero Hill Then and Now, it's really worth doing. But now it's 2019, 73 years since my arrival in San Francisco and Potrero Hill. And the freight trains are long gone from the bottom of the hill, and railroad tracks now go to nowhere. There's no cows will be found in the Bayview. There are still stores on 20th Street, but manicure and beauty parlors have replaced DeRosa's and Evie's. Acupuncture and holistic medicine are available. The Flea Hole is gone, as are the wonderful movies that made people feel good and want to dance. The big, beautiful brick building that was Daniel Webster is gone, but wonderfully, the school is still filled with happy children from many different backgrounds. In the 40s and 50s, there were no restaurants on the hill, but now we have an incredible choice of foods from all over the world. This is then and now. Times and people have changed, but Potrero Hill is still a wonderful place to live, with the best weather, views, and great people. I hope to be around for a long time. Thanks for letting me share my memories.
Thank you, Rosemarie. Thank you. Wow, wasn't that great? Stand up. Give her a hand. Thank you. What a great story. Oh, and here, the wonderful Mickey Ostler and the bouquet. Rosemarie, come back. Hey, thank you, Mickey.